What does it mean to protect your children from pain when your own heart is breaking? Is it possible to shield them from the chaos of divorce without losing yourself in the process? These questions linger in Margaret's mind as she sits in the dim glow of the living room lamp, staring at the remnants of a chaotic day. A crumpled juice box sits on the cappuccino table, surrounded by toy cars and crayons. The silence of the house feels heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Upstairs, the faint sound of giggles escapes through the cracks under her children's bedroom doors. Margaret runs her hands over her face, trying to steady herself. She's been so careful not to let them see her cry. To them, she's a wall of unwavering strength, the anchor holding their little world steady while everything else falls apart. But tonight, the weight of pretending feels unbearable. The divorce wasn't supposed to happen. At least, that's what she told herself every night for the past year. She replayed every argument, every broken promise, searching for the moment when it all went wrong. There was no single moment, though. It was 1,000 small cracks that spread over time, like a fragile vase held together by sheer will until it shattered completely. Her phone buzzes on the table, and the screen lights up with a text from her ex-husband. Another terse message about scheduling conflicts and custody arrangements. Margaret's jaw tightens as she reads it, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. She doesn't reply. Instead, she sets the phone down and closes her eyes, taking a deep breath to quiet the storm raging inside her. Later that night, as she tucks her daughter Quinn into bed, Margaret leans down to kiss her on the forehead. But Quinn catches her off guard with a question that pierces straight through her defenses. "Mommy, are you okay?" Margaret freezes, her heart pounding. She forces a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Quinn's face. "Of course, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" Quinn shrugs, her small voice hesitant. "You just look sad sometimes." Margaret's throat tightens, but she manages to laugh softly. "I'm just tired, honey. Nothing to worry about." But as she steps out of the room and closes the door behind her, Quinn's words echo in her mind. For the first time, Margaret wonders if hiding her pain is really protecting her children or if it's just pushing them further away. The next morning, Margaret sips her cappuccino at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the sunlight filters through the curtains. She can't shake Quinn's question, "Are you okay?" It felt like her daughter saw right through her carefully constructed mask. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snaps Margaret out of her thoughts. Moments later, her best friend Charlotte breezes through the door, carrying a box of donuts. "Morning, sunshine," Charlotte says with a grin, setting the box on the table. "Figured you could use a little pick-me-up." Margaret smiles weakly. "Thanks. I think I needed this." As they sit down, Charlotte studies her friend carefully. "You've been quiet lately. How's everything going with, divorce?" Margaret says flatly. The word feels heavy on her tongue. Charlotte nods. "I didn't want to bring it up, but I'm worried about you. You don't have to keep everything bottled up, Margaret shrugs, her fingers tracing the rim of her cappuccino mug. "I'm fine, just trying to keep things normal for the kids." Charlotte raises an eyebrow. "Normal? Margaret, you're going through one of the hardest things anyone can face. You don't have to pretend you've got it all together." The words hit a nerve. Margaret looks away, her eyes stinging with tears she refuses to let fall. "They need me to be strong," she says quietly. "Strength doesn't mean hiding how you feel," Charlotte replies gently. "Sometimes it means letting yourself fall apart so you can rebuild. Have you thought about talking to someone? A therapist, maybe?" Margaret shakes her head. "I don't have time, or money, and honestly, I don't even know where to start." Charlotte reaches across the table, placing a hand on Margaret's. "You don't have to do it alone. I can help you figure it out. Just promise me you'll think about it, okay?" That night, as Margaret lies in bed, she stares at the ceiling, Charlotte's words replaying in her mind. "Letting yourself fall apart so you can rebuild." The idea terrifies her, but something deep inside whispers that it might be exactly what she needs. The next morning, Charlotte calls with a recommendation for a therapist who offers free consultations. Just one session. Charlotte insists. "If it doesn't help, you don't have to go back." Margaret hesitates. but eventually she agrees. She doesn't tell Charlotte that her hands are shaking as she writes down the appointment details, or that she's already second-guessing her decision. As she hangs up the phone, a mixture of fear and hope swirls in her chest. Maybe this is the first step towards something betterer. Maybe it's just another crack in the fragile facade she's worked so hard to maintain. Either way, she knows there's no turning back. Margaret parked her car in front of the small, unassuming brick building and stared at the sign that read, "Counseling Services." She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The idea of walking through that door felt heavier than all the arguments and custody exchanges she'd endured since the divorce began. What was she even supposed to say? That she felt like she was drowning while pretending to stay afloat? That every decision she made was colored by guilt, fear, and exhaustion? Margaret inhaled deeply, gripping the steering wheel, and reminded herself why she was here, for her kids. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, with soft music playing in the background. She checked in, her voice barely above a whisper, and sat down, her legs bouncing nervously. "Margaret?" She looked up to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Hi, I'm Donna," the therapist said, extending a hand. "Come on in." The office felt saffron-neutral-colored walls, shelves lined with books, and a small window that let in natural light. Donna gestured toward a comfortable chair across from her. "So tell me what brought you here," Donna said gently, folding her hands in her lap. Margaret hesitated, her fingers twisting together. I guess I'm just trying to hold everything together. I have 5 kids, and I've been through a divorce recently. It's been hard, but I'm managing." "Managing?" Donna echoed, her tone soft but probing. Margaret let out a humorless laugh. "I guess that's what I call it. I don't really have a choice. They need me to keep things normal." "And what about what you need?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found she didn't know the answer. No one had asked her that in a long time. The conversation continued, and little by little, Margaret began to unravel her tightly held emotions. She talked about the sleepless nights, the weight of pretending, and the guilt she felt for not being enough for her kids. Donna listened patiently, occasionally offering insights that made Margaret pause and reflect. "You mentioned wanting to keep things normal for your kids," Donna said at one point. "But have you considered that allowing them to see you process your emotions might teach them how to process their own?" Margaret frowned, the thought foreign and unsettling. "But wouldn't that scare them? I don't want them to feel like everything's falling apart." "Being honest about your feelings doesn't mean losing control," Donna explained. "It can be as simple as saying, 'I'm having a hard day, but I'm working through it.' That kind of openness can actually make them feel safer." The session ended sooner than Margaret expected. As she walked back to her car, her mind buzzed with Donna's words. Could it really be okay to let her guard down, even just a little? Margaret decided to test the waters that evening. As she sat with her kids around the dinner table, she took a deep breath and said, "You know, I've been thinking about how things have been different lately, and I want you all to know that it's okay to talk to me about how you're feeling." Her youngest son, Alex, looked up from his plate, his face brightening. "Really? Like anything?" "Anything," Margaret said, forcing a smile. Her other children exchanged glances, unsure what to make of her sudden openness. Finally, Quinn spoke up. "What about you, Mom? How do you feel?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She hadn't expected the conversation to turn back to her. "I feel tired sometimes," she admitted cautiously, "and sad. But I'm working on it. And I'm here for you no matter what." Quinn's face softened, but the moment didn't last long. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she asked, her tone tinged with frustration. "I always thought you were fine, like nothing bothered you." Margaret felt a pang of guilt. "I thought I was protecting you," she said quietly. "But maybe I should have been more honest." As the conversation continued, Margaret realized that her children had been carrying more emotions than she'd anticipated. They talked about their fears, their confusion over the divorce, and the ways they missed their old life. It was messy and raw, but it was also a relief to hear their voices. But not everyone saw it that way. A few days later, during a tense co-parenting discussion, Margaret's ex-husband confronted her. You're telling the kids about your problems now? He snapped. What are you trying to do? Traumatize them? Margaret's stomach churned, but she stood her ground. I'm not burdening them, she said firmly. I'm letting them see that it's okay to have feelings. They need that. You always think you know best, he shot back. Just remember, you're not the only parent here. The argument left Margaret shaken. Was she doing the right thing? Donna's words echoed in her mind, but doubt crept in, threatening to undo the progress she'd made. That night, as she tucked her kids into bed, Margaret lingered in Quinn's room. I hope today wasn't too much, she said softly. Quinn looked up at her with wide eyes. No, Mom, I think it was good. I like when you talk to us like that. The words gave Margaret a glimmer of reassurance, but she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Vulnerability came at a cost, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to keep paying it. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen the next morning, nursing her second cup of cappuccino. The house was unusually quiet, as the kids had stayed with their dad the night before. The emptiness felt strange, almost foreign. For so long, her life had been filled with noise, the constant hum of activity. Now, the silence felt like a mirror, forcing her to face her own thoughts without distraction. She replayed the conversation with her ex-husband in her mind, his accusations still stinging. Was he right? Was she doing more harm than good by being vulnerable with the kids? Margaret had thought she was finally on the right path, but now doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of her confidence. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her messages until she found Charlotte's name. Hey, are you free to talk? She typed, her fingers hesitating over the send button before she pressed it. A few minutes later, Charlotte called. What's going on? Her friend asked, her voice warm and familiar. Margaret let out a sigh. I'm just second-guessing everything. I tried to be open with the kids, and it felt like it helped. But then Benjamin. She trailed off, the lump in her throat making it hard to continue. Benjamin what? Charlotte prompted. He thinks I'm dumping too much on them, that I'm making things worse, Margaret admitted, her voice cracking. Charlotte didn't respond right away, and Margaret braced herself for judgment. But instead, Charlotte's tone was calm, steady. Listen, Benjamin isn't living your life. He doesn't see what you're doing every day to keep things together. And let's be honest, probably not thrilled about you taking control of this situation. Margaret hadn't thought of it that way. But what if he's right? What if I'm just confusing them more? Margaret, Charlotte said firmly, you're doing what feels right for you and your family. You're trying to show them that emotions aren't something to hide. That's not confuse, it's human. Don't let Benjamin insecurities make you question yourself. The reassurance felt like a lifeline. Margaret sat back in her chair, feeling a flicker of gratitude for Charlotte's unwavering support. By the time she hung up, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even her ex-husband, derail her progress. But she also realized she couldn't navigate this journey alone. Therapy wasn't just a one-time thing. It had to become a part of her life if she wanted real change. A week later, Margaret walked into Donna's office for her second session. This time, she felt less hesitant, less guarded. She had questions, lots of theme, and a determination to figure out how to navigate this new part of her life. I've been thinking about what you said last time, Margaret began, settling into the chair. About letting my kids see my emotions. I tried it, but now I feel exposed. Vulnerable. Donna nodded thoughtfully. That's natural. Vulnerability is uncomfortable, especially when you're used to hiding how you feel. But let me ask you this. How did your kids respond? Margaret paused, thinking back to Quinn's words. I like when you talk to us like that. A small smile tugged at her lips. Better than I expected, I guess. They seemed relieved almost. That's a good sign, Donna said. It means they're beginning to trust that it's safe to share their own feelings with you. That's how you build emotional resilience as a family. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious. But what about Benjamin? He thinks I'm doing more harm than good, and part of me wonders if he's right. I don't want to confuse the kids or make things harder for them. Donna's gaze was steady. Benjamin is entitled to his opinions, but you're the one living in this reality. You're the one doing the work. If your instincts are telling you this is the right path, then trust them. Parenting through divorce isn't about perfection, it's about authenticity and effort. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a sense of clarity. The doubt didn't vanish entirely, but it began to loosen its grip. As the session continued, Donna guided Margaret through an exercise. Think about the story you're telling yourself about this divorce, she said. Are you viewing it as a failure, or as a change that's leading you toward growth? The question stopped Margaret in her tracks. She'd never considered that the way she framed her own experience could impact how she lived through it. That's hard to answer, Margaret admitted. That's okay, Donna said with a smile. It's not about having the answer right away. It's about staying curious. What if you started asking yourself, how is this divorce teaching me to be stronger, to be more present? As Margaret left the office that day, she felt a small but noticeable shift in her perspective. Divorce didn't have to be the end of her story. Maybe it could be the beginning of something new. Her thoughts lingered on the idea as she pulled into the driveway. The house was quiet, but the air inside felt less heavy than it had before. She made a mental note to ask her kids what they thought about their new family dynamic, not in a forced way, but as a real conversation. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe rebuilding wasn't about erasing the cracks, but about learning to live with them, to let the light shine through. It was a Saturday morning, and Margaret found herself in the living room, surrounded by her children. The house buzzed with quiet energy as they sorted through old photo albums, some pages sticking together, others frayed at the edges. Laughter erupted occasionally when someone stumbled across a particularly funny memory. Alex pointed to a photo of the family from years ago, back when Margaret and Benjamin were still together. Why don't we all live in the same house anymore? He asked, his innocent question cutting through the warmth of the moment. The room grew quiet. Margaret felt the familiar pang in her chest, but knew this was one of those moments Donna had prepared her for. Well, she began, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes, even when two people care about each other, they realize they're not meant to stay together forever. Your dad and I decided it was best for us to live apart, but that doesn't change how much we both love you. Alex frowned, his small fingers tracing the edges of the photo. But why couldn't you just fix it? Margaret leaned in, pulling him close. Sometimes, fixing things doesn't mean putting them back the way they were. It means finding a new way to move forward. That's what we're doing now, building a new kind of family. The words felt heavy, but they also felt true. Divorce was messy and painful, but it had also forced her to grow in ways she hadn't expected. It taught her that life didn't come with neat endings or perfect resolutions, but with opportunities to rebuild piece by piece. As the day went on, Margaret noticed how her children moved through the house with a little more ease. They were learning to embrace their new normal, just as she was. Later that evening, Margaret sat on the porch with Quinn, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The two of them shared a blanket, the air crisp but not unkind. "Mom?" Quinn said, her voice soft. "Yes, honey? I'm glad you tell us how you feel now," Quinn admitted, glancing at her mom with a small smile. "It makes me feel like I can tell you stuff too." Margaret felt her throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from sadness. "That means so much to me, Em," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the sky shift to shades of pink and gold. Margaret's journey through divorce hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. There were still days when doubt crept in, when memories of the life she once had threatened to pull her under. But she had learned to anchor herself in the present, to find strength in vulnerability and connection. Divorce had shattered the illusion of a perfect family, but in its place, it had offered something unexpected, an opportunity to rebuild, not as a failure, but as a woman who was learning, growing, and healing. Her family wasn't broken, it was evolving. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt hopeful about the future. As she tucked her children into bed that night, Margaret reflected on the path ahead. Divorce would always be a part of their story, but it didn't have to define it. Instead, it could be the beginning of something new, a family built on honesty, resilience, and love. And with that thought, Margaret turned off the lights, ready to face whatever came next.